much, John. I appreciate the introduction. I want to thank John and Darlene and all the people on the Women's History Committee who made this possible for me to be here today. I love to talk about Mary Wollstonecraft, and really there's no better time than as a kickoff for Women's History Month. She is, in my mind, one of our great thinkers and writers about human rights and women's rights, and she's little known, actually. Even I found in England that people where she's from, people don't know her as well as they ought to, and nearly as well as they know her very famous daughter, Mary Shelley. So I want to talk today. I'll give some very brief background on who Wollstonecraft is, but then I really want to talk about my personal journey in writing the novel and writing Mary Wollstonecraft, which was a journey for me as a writer and a woman to really come to understand who she was, how she lived her life, and why it still matters to us. So for those of you who don't know who Mary Wollstonecraft is, she's often confused with her daughter, who sometimes went as Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. Mary Wollstonecraft was born in 1759 and died when she was 38 years old, 10 days after she gave birth to Mary Shelley. She died from puerperal fever. So over the course of her too short life, she, again, became one of the most important 18th century philosophers about the rights of human beings and the rights of women that we have. She most famously, after the French Revolution, the conservative Edmund Burke wrote a letter sort of attacking the ideals of the French Revolution and arguing for the monarchy and for the church as being the guiding forces in people's lives. And Mary wrote very quickly a pamphlet called Vindication of the Rights of Man, which was very much an argument for the French Revolution and against the monarchy and against the church, and argued for the ideals of the French Revolution. So, as you can imagine, that was quite scandalous when people understood that it was a woman who had written it. But not to be outdone even by herself, 6 weeks later, she published another pamphlet called Vindication of the Rights of Woman, which was an argument that, in fact, women in mind and soul are equal to men and deserve equal opportunities at education, which was the most important thing, and to have agency in their lives and not just be relegated to wives and mothers and subjects. And that, even more so than Vindication of the Rights of Man, was a hugely, hugely controversial pamphlet, but it was one of the, very, very earliest statements, philosophical statements and arguments about the equality of women and the rights that women deserve the same human rights that men do. So that's, by way of background, why she's so important politically. She does many other things in her life as a writer and a thinker, but those are the things she's probably most known for. So what happens when Mary Wollstonecraft dies at 38 years old, and this is the reason why we know so little about her, I think, why she's an undersung hero, is that her husband, William Godwin, also a philosopher, was really brokenhearted about her loss. And he considered her his equal as a philosopher and as a writer. And he very quickly wrote a memoir about Mary Wollstonecraft. And he sort of decided to give the full, really elaborate, intricate, and intimate details of her life, including sex outside of marriage, an out-of-wedlock child, her crippling anxiety, her bouts of depression, her her 2 suicide attempts. And this just scandalized everyone. And so, of course, the conservatives in England used it to say, you see, Mary Wollstonecraft was nothing but a whore, and no one should listen to her. We shouldn't read her anymore. Let's just put her to bed. She's gone now. Let's forget Mary Wollstonecraft. So, in a way, she's not really resurrected until 1929, when Virginia Woolf writes a famous essay about Mary Wollstonecraft and says, I can still feel, we still feel the living, breathing, experimenting, Mary Wollstonecraft. She is alive among us. And I think that the importance of that is this idea of how modern she felt to Virginia Woolf even then, and that we had lost this incredible voice and this incredible work, who, although feminism, the word did not exist in the 18th century, Mary Wollstonecraft is considered by many the mother of feminism. And if she doesn't know the word, she invents the life. So she really tries, during her 38 years, from the time she's a teenager through the end of her life, she tries to live by her ideals. Her brother Ned is deemed worthy of education in the family, and she really is not. And so what does she do? She goes out and starts a girls' school, which, in North London, at a really unusual time to do that. And she's absolutely dedicated to the idea that girls should have the same access to, to books, to philosophy, to learning, to thinking, to writing, as boys do. And so she's an incredibly important advocate for the education of young women. She travels alone to Portugal to be with her friend who's dying of tuberculosis, but by herself at a time when women didn't take sea voyages by themselves. She, after an unhappy stint as a governess for a very wealthy family in Ireland, she returns to London and goes to a publisher, Joseph Johnson, and says, I intend to make my life and my living as a writer. And no one did that then. This is in the late 18th century, and it just was not done. And Joseph Johnson said, I will help you. She found allies, and she was opposed for herself to marriage, the idea of marriage, because she thought that marriage oppressed both women and men, but especially women. And this is, the reason she had an affair outside of marriage, a child out of wedlock. She believed that marriage was an institution that was by its nature oppressive. So she's really, for her time, just an unbelievable free thinker, but she's not just thinking and writing, she's living by her ideals, and she's suffering because of it. I mean, when the French Revolution happens, she and a bunch of her friends, they want to go and be witnesses to the revolution. Well, the friends all chicken out, but Mary goes by herself to Paris to be a witness to the revolution and stays there even when the English are sort of being hunted by the French as enemies of the revolution. She stays in France to chronicle, to be a witness, to what to her is one of the most important revolutions, really, in the history of human rights. So she's just an extraordinary woman. And even when she ends up marrying Godwin, and she only marries him, they both agree that marriage is oppressive. The only reason she agrees to marry him is because she has suffered through what it's like to have an out of wedlock child before, and she doesn't want to do that again. When she gets pregnant a second time, they get married. And, even in her marriage, you see her to the very end in her letters fighting for equality in her own marriage. Are you going to have writing time? Well, I want writing time. When will you take care of the children? When will I take care of the children? She's really fighting not just for the rights of all women. She's fighting for her own rights within her own relationships, her own marriage. And so, this is the woman that I come to. The origin of Love and Fury is that I'm sitting in my agent's office, who's a wonderful English woman in New York, and I've spent years and years writing about Charles Dickens, which ended in my first novel, Mr. Dickens and His Carol. And I owe my publisher a second book, and I really, not only do I not know what to write about, but I'm having a really hard time letting go of Charles Dickens because he's become, part of my family, basically, having written about him and worked with him for 15 or 20 years. And it was the 200th anniversary of Frankenstein. So Mary Shelley was everywhere. She was just in the zeitgeist. And my agent said, well, what about Mary Wollstonecraft? Everyone knows who Mary Shelley is, but almost no one knows who Mary Wollstonecraft is. And she's so important. So, I sort of making the same mistake so many people do, in an instant was confusing Wollstonecraft with Shelley. But I, immediately began to read about her. I read biographies. I read her collected letters. I started to read her own writing. And quickly you realize, oh my God, this woman is so important to the history of women's rights. I mean, she is an icon, an avatar of feminism and the idea of women's equality. And so, I thought, well, God, she's a fantastic subject, but also how do I approach a subject that important, a figure of that kind of stature. And, I came to understand very quickly that the only way to approach it was not thinking of Mary as an icon, an avatar, but as a human being with flesh, blood, hope, fury, love, despair in her experience. And, I also realized how modern her ideas seem to me now. And that in a way I was tasked with making her human, but also connecting her to the continuum that we still live on. We are still living, in the patriarchy that Mary Wollstonecraft identifies as being an oppressive institution. We are still in it. And so many of the issues, which I'm happy to talk about later if you want to, so many of the issues are still the same issues for women. So I want to talk a little bit about, again, how you tackle a subject so big and a life, that's, even though it's 38 years, it's still 38 years of life. With Dickens, I had written about a 6-week period in his life when he's writing A Christmas Carol. And that was a much different thing. In some ways, when you have a constraint like that, a framing constraint like that, it gives you a lot of room to play. But with Wollstonecraft, I felt a responsibility to do her justice and to really understand, to try to encapsulate life, her development as a human being and as a thinker and as a woman. And, in the beginning, it's so intimidating, not just because she's intimidating, but because the biographies are so good. I mean, for instance, one of my favorite biographies is a dual biography of Mary Wollstonecraft and her daughter, Mary Shelley, called Romantic Outlaws by Charlotte Gordon. It's just a fantastic book. And they're alternating chapters, really about the parallels in the lives of mother and daughter. But I thought it was a page turner and kind of a barn burner and sometimes a bodice ripper. And, when I finished the biography, among others, by giants in the biography world, Janet, Claire Tomlin. Oh gosh, I'm forgetting Janet's last name. I'm so sorry. But anyway, these giants in the field of biography who've written about Wollstonecraft. And so initially you think, well, why would I write a novel of her life? It's all here, and it's so riveting and compelling. And then I started to realize, but wait, there are cracks in the story that a scholar or a biographer cannot confirm. They can conjecture, but they're missing facts. Whole caches of letters will be burned and so, they don't really understand how to write entirely about Mary Wollstonecraft's love affair, kind of platonic love affair with artist Henry Fuseli, which is very important in her life. And so, the novelist begins to sort of, read the biographies and look for where those cracks are, because that gives the novelist room to play. And in addition to the cracks, you see too that biographers leave you crumbs along the way. That these are things they wish they could follow, that they wish they could find documentation and evidence of, and they can't. But they sort of are just leaving the crumbs for the novelist, who can then pick them up and play. The great Hilary Mantel, who wrote Wolf Hall, the trilogy Wolf Hall, and one of my favorite books about the French Revolution, said, "My starting point is where the facts run out." And Alexander Chee says it like this: the historical novel describes what might have happened within what happened, the feeling of being free within the machine of one's fate. Dare I even say the old consciousness, which is a Henry James idea. So I really started thinking, with these cracks and crumbs, like, who is the living, breathing, experimenting Wollstonecraft? Who was the actual young girl who came to understand that her drunken father was essentially raping her mother every night? And so at some point finds it so intolerable that she makes the radical decision to act and decides that she will lie across the threshold of her mother's door every night. And her father steps over her, but she, as an act of protest, she lies down in front of her mother's door to signal to her father, "I know what you're doing, and it is criminal." So, this is like through her own experiences as a teenage girl, she comes to have a sense of injustice, an innate sense, an experience of injustice, and the ways in which women and girls, young girls especially, are not treated the same way young boys are in the family. She's expected to learn how to embroider and speak a little bit of French, and maybe she could be a governess, but no kind of education beyond that. And this is a woman with an extraordinary, curious, hungry mind, who has to, in effect, become self-taught. So, I start to ask these questions. Who's the young woman who meets another woman, Fanny Blood, who may be the true love of her life, who is driven to near madness and self-sabotage by her discovery of sexual desire and frustration, who eschews marriage and declares she'll support herself as a writer, who chooses to have a child out of wedlock, who goes off by herself to witness a revolution in real time, even when it threatens her life, who sails alone with a 3-year-old and a young nanny to a strange land to prove her worth and love to a man who doesn't love her back, who's driven by heartbreak twice to suicide, who suffers trauma after trauma after trauma, but survives, like so many of us. So I begin by doing this, by thinking of Mary as a young girl, as a young woman, as a mother, experiences that I've had myself. How are those feelings and those experiences still the same? I want to know not Mary the hero, the icon, but Mary the human being, a woman being. So Ursula Le Guin, really one of my favorite writers, says, this is why I like novels. Instead of heroes, they have people in them. So the task for me is really, to begin to find in my voice in Mary's, and Mary's voice in mine. And the way that I felt that I could do that was by understanding, again, what is the experience, even though we're separated by these 2 centuries, what are the experiences that are still fundamental to being a woman? What are the same emotions, the same experiences, the same feelings, because we swim in the same water, we swim in the same patriarchy that she believed had failed us. She said, "I have seen enough of human civilization to know that the world run by men have utterly failed us. So Wollstonecraft is born into this old consciousness, this old sort of 18th century consciousness. But because of her accumulation of personal experience, comes to recognize and understand the water she's swimming in, which is, an oppressive monarchy, an oppressive church, an oppressive patriarchy. The same water, I think, that we swim in now. So the novelist, waits and waits for that Mary to start talking to me, to start talking to her in her own words about her own subjectivity and thoughts and feelings. You can't hear, as I said, you can't hear her voice in yours until you can also hear your voice in hers. So, and in Escape, I'm also writing out of my own consciousness, my own time, but that was really the task, was to try to understand, the ways in which our experience as women today connects to her experience as a woman then. So the other thing, as a writer, what you have to do then is figure out, and how exactly are you going to accomplish the writing of this incredible story? And so I'm very much, I cut my teeth as a screenwriter. So I'm very plot driven. I'm really a structuralist as a writer. I outline a lot. I spend a lot of time, drawing thought maps and all kinds of things. But I put, in fact, right here along my living room wall, I put up a giant piece of butcher paper that was there for months and got multicolored Post-it notes. And whenever I was reading, a biography or her letters or her own writing, I would scribble something down that seemed important and put it up somewhere on the butcher block paper, because I was trying to find a structure to her life, a structure to the story. Because it's a novel. I'm not writing a biography. I'm writing a novel, and it needs a structure that I can sort of hang her life on, like hooks that you can hang the silk of her life on. And so, eventually I had all these colors and this long thing and all these experiences she had that were formative in her life, but it still felt overwhelming to me. And so at that point, I went back to this idea that had always fascinated me, that she and Mary Shelley, who was only an infant, of course, for those 10 days between Mary giving birth to her daughter, Mary Shelley, and her own death from puerperal fever 10 days later, what were those 10 days? What would happen to a person who was experiencing those 10 days. Now, in the first 5 days after Mary Shelley was born, she was born weak and low. She didn't nurse, and it was believed that the child might not live. In fact, there were rumors in the house that a small coffin was being built for her. Well, eventually, the child does start to suckle, but meanwhile, a doctor's come, because Mary's placenta didn't deliver, and a doctor has come and not washed his hands to deliver her placenta. And so she contracts puerperal fever. And over the last of the 10 days, 5 days, everyone comes to realize that she's dying. And so I really thought about what would be the stories? What would be the story you would want to tell your daughter? What kind of, first, the stories you tell to coax her into the world, to affirm her existence here, to make her live and want to live. And then when you realize you're dying, what are the stories that you leave as your legacy? So, this became a kind of framing device for the novel. I wanted the novel to exist in those 10 days. And there was a midwife. There are alternating chapters between a midwife, Parthenia Blenkinsop, and Mary Wollstonecraft. And the midwife is sort of saying, what's happening in the room and in the house. And then Mary, in a more disembodied voice, is telling a story from her life. And so, that sort of forced me to choose the 10 most important, most formative stories in Mary's life, the things she would tell. And the way I think of it, the way screenwriters think of it, too, and the way I think of it as a novelist as well, is, what are the plot points in a life? And, I always think any one of us, if someone asked us to do it, could choose the 10 moments in our life where, as characters, we are put under the most pressure and have to make a decision, and do make a decision. And that decision alters the trajectory of our life. So, I consider those plot points. I think we could all do it with our own lives if we had to, but it is certainly a way to think about character, because that's the only way you know character in a book, is by seeing them put under pressure and seeing them choose. And that choice changes who they are, not just in what they, how they make the decision, moral, ethical, situational, logistical, but how that decision changes their future, often in ways they don't even understand. And so that was a way for me to really begin to pick, the 10 most important stories in Mary's life. It was a frame that I could use to discover the novel and discover who she was, and really go inside, these 10 episodes from her life that would explicate who she was and who she became. What was the pressure she was under, as a teenage girl, as a young woman, as a woman, and what did she do in reaction to those pressures, and who did she become as a result of it? So it was a way, it was very important for me as a novelist to have that frame, to have that structure, begin to see the novel take shape. It was like, building a life moment by moment, plot point by plot point, the same way we build ours, actually. And, it felt in a way like she was choosing her own adventure, each time that, and, any character is faced with really difficult decisions, and watching her choose, watching Mary Wollstonecraft make these decisions as a woman trying to live independently in the late 18th century was extraordinary. So that is really how I came to, be able to sort of bring her to life in my own mind through these very specific experiences, trying to imagine, well, what was it really like? What was that conversation like? What was the relationship like? So going back to this idea of cracks and crumbs that biographers leave us, just as an example, I alluded to the fact that Mary meets, when she's about 18 years old, a really remarkable young woman who's named Fanny Blood. And Fanny quickly becomes her best friend. Mary considers her more refined, unequal intellectually, a great friend, a great confidant, and they become very, very close. Well, almost every biographer you read conjectures that it's possible they may have been lovers of some kind. Even if it was platonic, but there's no proof of it, because no one in the 18th century would leave proof behind like that. So, the novelist, that's a place the novelist can play and really try to get, inside of that relationship, and try to enlarge it. And in a way, it started to feel like it was a gift that I could give back to Mary Wollstonecraft in return for everything she gave me, that I could give her the gift of a fuller relationship, imagined relationship with Fanny Blood. And, that's the great advantage of a novelist, being able to play like that. But in the areas, as I said, with Henry Fuseli, a whole cache of letters, a great intellectual and painter whom she falls in love with. It's a platonic crush, in a way, a profound infatuation for her that is never consummated, as far as we know. But the letters between Henry Fuseli and Mary Wollstonecraft are later burned. no one knows what's in them. And so again, I got to imagine, what that was like, what that experience was like for Mary. And that is the great fun of being a novelist. There were times when I doubted that I was up to the task of telling her story, that I could really do her justice, that I was finding my voice in hers. But every time I returned to the idea that, well, some things have changed for women and they are empowered and they do have access to education, there are so many ways in which we still do not have equal rights with men. And people often ask me, well, what would Mary Wollstonecraft say if she time traveled and could be alive today? And I always say, I think she'd be stunned by how much has changed, and then stunned by how little has changed. That we are, in fact, still fighting, in 2023, we are still fighting for bodily autonomy, for equal access to so many things, for equal pay, for agency in our own lives, to not be controlled by men, but to make our own decisions. Excuse me. And understanding, staying in touch with that continuum, knowing that, Mary lived in a way as a woman that is still the way we often live as women, even though we live in different times, that was a way to stay close to her and find her voice, and find, again, my voice in hers. So, that's kind of an overview of how I came to what I came to understand about Mary, how I wrote the novel. I'd love to talk about anything that anyone else wants to talk about. Thanks, John.
Okay, great. Thank you. And for everybody in the audience, you can quote unquote raise your hand if you wish and ask a question, or again, at the bottom of your screen, you can type a question into the chat box and I'll read it aloud, whichever you want to do. I know there's several people in the audience that you've already read the book, and so I'm sure that you have some questions for Samantha. So while you're just thinking about that, Samantha, I'll ask a quick question and then they can get typing or thinking about what they want to ask. Do you see any parallels between Mary Wollstonecraft and Dickens, since you've done so much writing on Dickens?
Oh, I've never had that question, John. That's a really wonderful question. I do indeed. Charles Dickens was, aside from being, one of the great, almost to the level of Shakespeare, I think, as a writer in the Western world, was a crusader and a philanthropist, and was outraged by the inequalities that he saw, particularly between rich and poor, and literates and illiterates, people who had access to education and people who didn't. It outraged him. It fueled his writing. I mean, people forget that A Christmas Carol, is really a story about, inequality and the ways in which it's so important for people to take responsibility for those who have less, as opposed to protecting their own. And so, Dickens was very much a crusader about all of these subjects, about, particularly children living in poverty, women living in poverty, women with children living in poverty.
Right.
He fought,
Right.
Really hard for the education of women, and created with the philanthropist Angela Burdett Coutts, I think, created kind of a home for women who had been forced into prostitution.
Right.
Because of poverty, and so that they could have another way to make a living and, access to education. So I see him very much as an advocate and in fact a crusader for the rights of the poor,
Right.
access to education,
Right.
and in some ways the rights of women to be literate and have other ways to make a living besides having to sell their bodies because they lived in poverty. So
Very
Wollstonecraft, is I think seeing the same things and arguing for the same things that Dickens
Okay.
is.
All right, Darlene, you have your hand raised, so go ahead and ask your question. And then there's some stuff
Yes,
coming in the
yes.
chat box, Samantha.
Thank
So
you. We really enjoyed reading your novel and talking about it. We had a book study where several of us got together and read and talked about your book. One thing that at first really bothered us was that such a strong woman who would do all of these amazing things, like from beginning, like you said, sleeping across or laying across her mother's doorway, that she would try to commit suicide when a man jilted her. And I think, based on what you said today, and then going back and thinking through different parts of the novel, the title being Love and Fury, on passions, that instead of you talked about her first as a philosopher, but then, that you wanted to bring in this passion. And I think that as we go through and look through the novel, that you really tried to emphasize that. Even in the novel that she wrote, she said, no, it's not sense, it's sensibility in the author. That's her genius. So I just, again, wanted to ask you, I guess that was intentional throughout to sort of make sense of her, and that thing that seems so senseless of her trying to commit suicide twice because of a man.
Yes. I love this question. And people do object to it. They want her not to be a person who tries to take her life. But I would say, another thing that Dickens and Wollstonecraft have in common is bouts of severe depression. So, we know now that depression is a disease. And that she was powerless. There was really nothing to be done. I mean, Dickens would take 20-mile night walks through the city of London to try to deal with his demons. Wollstonecraft also loved nature and being outside, but there was so little available to people to try to tackle their depression in this time. Much less a word for it or any sort of recognition or awareness about it. So I would say that first of all, that in doing her justice, I sort of have to be true to the complexities of her mental life, of what it really was to be Mary Wollstonecraft. Because again, she's not a hero in her mind. She's flesh and blood and experiencing all the emotions that women often experience. I mean, we look at now, the epidemic of depression and anxiety among teenage girls in America, among young women. It's I think for many of the same reasons that Wollstonecraft would have felt it then. Oppressed, ignored, sort of living for the male gaze. I mean, there's so many things that are similar, but I also want to bring up this thing about Sense and Sensibility, because I think when I started writing this, I thought Sense and Sensibility was something Jane Austen had basically, invented as an idea. I didn't really understand that Sense and Sensibility was this century-long, philosophical conversation that was basically a kind of tension between the Enlightenment and reason and the coming Romantic movement, which is much more rooted in the individual subjectivity and experience and the emotional life and connection to nature. And so Mary Wollstonecraft is very much sort of caught in this tension all of her life, because she believes in reason and the importance of women being taught how to think. That was one of the main goals of her school, of her girls' school, was for women to understand how to think, but also begin to trust their own experience and trust their own stories and tell their own stories, which is so radical for the time. But she also wants them and wanted herself to be finely tuned to one's emotional life. So rather than dismiss one's emotions, which, as we know, can be so overpowering and overwhelming, to try to filter them through the faculty of reason, so that you can come to a kind of beautiful marriage of sense with sensibility. This is what Wollstonecraft argues for all her life. But as we know, as women, even if we want that, we often fail at it. And so she did then, and I thought it was important to be true to her just human experience of making bad choices in love. I mean, she falls in love with the American speculator Gilbert Imlay, who basically turns out to be a con man. And but she's really desperately infatuated with him. And so sensibility takes over her sense, and she's not able to see, as so many of us still do, she's not able to see the creep that he is, and his sort of failures as a human being. She idolizes him. She's caught up in this sort of lust and limerence of this new relationship, and she's unable to see him clearly. I'm so glad she didn't kill herself, and that she survives both suicide attempts, to go on. And I'm sad. I still feel sad that after her second suicide attempt, when she jumps off Putney Bridge, but is saved by a wherryman, that she dies still about a year later of puerperal fever, because I think there was so much more life left in her, and so much more work and writing that she had to do. But I, again, Darlene, I really love the question, because, in some ways, for me, the novel is very much about sense and sensibility, and the journey of the midwife, who's someone I didn't want to only be a literary device, but I wanted her to have a narrative arc of her own. That her journey is very much from sense only, from reason, logic, to emotion and sensibility. And so in that way, they are foils for each other. But she's a complex human being, as we are, and had failings and disappointments. And I wanted those to be part of the novel and part of the human experience.
Okay, the next question, I'm just going to adapt a little bit because it's related to the suicide, but it asks about her anxieties, which led to those suicides. So can you speak to those anxieties, and are they the same types of anxieties that people who feel that hopeless or feel that despair, are those similar today, or in what ways do you think they're different? This is from a colleague of mine named Dahlia. So
thank you for the question. I'm not an expert at all in this area, and so I had to make all kinds of assumptions. Mary writes about her own anxiety in her letters. She'll talk about trembling fits, about not being able to sleep, about a kind of incessant worry, going over and over things in her head. I think that those are things we all recognize today. I mean, she would have panic, what we would call panic attacks, but she describes as trembling fits. And so I think, brain chemistry hasn't changed in 200 years. My guess is that anxiety and panic attacks and depression felt very similarly then to what they still do now, still feel like. So I have to, unfortunately, in the 18th and 19th century, women's, keenly tuned sensations and emotions are considered hysteria. And, often it's dangerous to talk about these kinds of experiences, because you might be committed, you might be put away. And men had the ability to do that because women were really, their property in England. Women were the property of men in England. And so, as were children. So it's kind of a dangerous, radical thing that she so openly talks about her anxiety and her depression, not with words that are the same words we use today, only because we have a more sophisticated understanding of it. I think it would have been both, for Dickens and for Wollstonecraft, Prozac would have been life-changing, but we also may not have had what we got from them. It's very hard to know to what extent their genius arises from their trauma, or their fuel. The fuel for their writing and thinking arises from their trauma.
Right.
As for Charles Dickens, seeing his dad go to debtor's prison when he was, 11, 12 years
Right.
old, having to stay by himself for a year and work at Warren's blacking warehouse. That formed so much about him as a human being, that trauma. So I think Wollstonecraft is formed by her traumas as well. And we understand trauma better now, but they didn't have access to the resources we do now.
Okay, the next question is from Susan. It's really a comment more, but Dahlia, I hope I characterized your question okay. But this is from Susan. She says, I really like the way you withheld the information that the midwife's husband had recently died until later in the narrative. It seems to me to add to the reader's sympathy for her and for her changed position in the world. Could you comment on that novelistic technique, please?
Oh, thank you for this question. Mary Blenkinsop is really the only truly fictional character in the whole novel. Everyone else is based on someone real, and I tried to get as close as I could or felt comfortable getting. Mary did have a midwife from the Westminster Lying In. Her name was Blenkinsop, and that's all we know about her. So everything else I made up. But as I said, I didn't want her to only be a literary device for, sort of explaining this is how you're going to know what's going on in the room day to day. I wanted her to be a real character and to have an arc of her own. And so I saw her as someone who had sort of found a way to live in, her own, the logic of her world. Like this is what I know about. I know about birthing babies. I know how to do it. I don't like this whole, men insinuating themselves as doctors and accouchés into the birthing room. I don't feel good about that. That doesn't feel right to me. But sort of her what she cuts off is an emotional life with her husband because she's not able to have children, an emotional and, healthy sexual relationship with her husband for their long life together. And so, this kind of occurred to me. I didn't know coming out of the gate who Blenkinsop would end up being, but I did want her to change, to be different at the end. And I felt like her interaction with Mary Wollstonecraft and Godwin and the whole household and the way they live, this sort of modern way they talk about, an open way they talk about love and, and equality and emotion, that it really begins to kind of take down the boundaries, the walls around her that are self-created. And so she comes out of her own grief and exhaustion, really, comes to be changed by that experience. And, it's, I think, also a way when you write a novel, you're changed by the experience. I'm changed by being close to Mary Wollstonecraft. And so I want Blenkinsop to have that experience well. And so there's a kind of opening. In fact, their goodbye scene when Blenkinsop and Mary say goodbye right before she dies is one of my favorite scenes just to write. And it's still very emotional to me when I read it because they feel real to me. They don't feel like people I invented. They feel like real women who've made this connection and shared this experience. And they have this kind of beautiful moment of joining sense with sensibility and faith. And Mrs. Blenkinsop's faith with Mary's doubt. And it's a scene that is important to me. And I hope it sort of takes Blenkinsop all the way to a satisfying end to her own narrative arc.
Okay, we've got time for a couple more questions. I think Darlene has another one, so go ahead, Darlene.
Yes, we just wanted to say from the book club how much we really enjoyed your creation of the other characters, real people, like Imlay taking advantage of Daniel Boone, which we think may not have been known for sure, but you made that something that was real. And then her dinners at Johnson's house with Darwin and Fuselier, I always kind of felt like they all needed some HR training, that they sort of picked on her in a way that maybe, I don't know, were you trying to make that like something she enjoyed, or maybe something that women just had to endure, or that she endured because she was an outspoken woman?
Yeah, that's wonderful. I loved writing those scenes at Joseph Johnson. So Joseph Johnson is the publisher who helps Mary, and agrees. Basically, he publishes everything she writes throughout her adult life, which makes it possible for her to live independently as a writer. But he felt so warmly toward Mary and was such a believer in her as an equal, that he was the one who invited her to dinner. She was expected to be there every single night. And so everyone else was an ever-changing cast of characters. But Mary walked across the Thames to be at Joseph Johnson's dinner table, every day at 5:00, unless she was unable. And so she was actually the constant and the dinner regular, because Johnson so believed in her. And so, this other cast of characters that are gathered around, I mean, Mary almost always was the only woman at the dinner table. And, they come to call her in the book just Wollstonecraft, which she takes as a compliment, that what she wants is to be one of them. She doesn't want to be seen as the woman at the table. She wants to be seen as equal to them. And so to me, every conversation around the dinner table is ultimately about a debate about that, about her own subjectivity, about the validity of her experience as a human being, about women's equality. And I just, I loved writing those scenes. I wanted all of those people to come alive and sort of, so that we as readers could encounter Wollstonecraft as they might have encountered her, like as a woman who stood up for herself, who had strong opinions, who wasn't afraid, who didn't back down. That was very unusual. A woman at a dinner table, at that time in the world, it was fine, if she had good manners and, didn't eat or drink too much. But Wollstonecraft is something else altogether. She can hold her own with any of these men who are the great intellects, the great thinkers and writers of the time. She holds her own. And I love that about her. And I loved writing those scenes. It was so much fun to do.
Okay.
Well, we very much enjoyed it.
Yeah. Sorry, Darlene, I didn't mean to interrupt. I apologize. So last question for our students, Samantha. Where do they start if they want to read Wollstonecraft and they want to read Dickens? Where do they start?
Gosh, okay.
No pressure, though.
Yeah. Somebody might say Vindication of the Rights of Woman is a very short book. It's very dense. I mean, I think I'm pretty smart about Wollstonecraft, but even I find it kind of hard to follow all the time. My favorite book is the very last thing she wrote. It's also very short. It's called, usually it's called something like Letters Written in a Short Residence in Scandinavia. And it's the book that she wrote when she was traveling with her 3-year-old Fanny and Nanny throughout Scandinavia to try to find this missing ship of Gilbert Imlay's missing silver ship. And the reason that I love it is because it's shockingly modern. It's part travelogue, part philosophical treatise, part love letter, part suicide note. It's this, mashup that now, we wouldn't think, we would just think, oh, well, that's what a contemporary book is like. People can mash up all kinds of things, memoir, doing autofiction. Right. And so, but, her voice as well, she's a beautiful writer, writing about her interior life, about nature, about the world that she encounters, her intellectual life. And I just find it accessible, incredibly moving, and very modern. And it's a great entree into Wollstonecraft.
Letters from Scandinavia?
Yes,
okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Often. And then, again, I think the dual biography by Charlotte Gordon, Romantic Outlaws, is fantastic.
Okay.
With Dickens,
Yeah, where do you start? I know that was an unfair question.
I know. I suppose David Copperfield.
Yeah.
I'm still working my way through Bleak House. I've not read all of Dickens, but I really love David Copperfield is the most autobiographical.
Yeah.
Quite closely follows Dickens' own life, and it's a really wonderful book. And there have been so many great interpretations of it on screen. In fact, I just read Barbara Kingsolver's Demon Copperhead,
Right.
close retelling of David Copperfield. So it's a marvelous introduction, not just to what Dickens can do as a writer, but who he is as a human being, because he very much, connects with David Copperfield as a character.
Well, this has been a wonderful hour. I would like to thank you, Samantha, on behalf of our Women's History Month, all the people that have been involved in bringing you to us and making this possible. Thank you. I'd like to thank our students for being in attendance today. And this has been great. It's been great to meet you. And thank you so much.
I've really enjoyed being here. Thank you so much.
Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe for more content from LSC-Kingwood.